Welcome to After the War, Reconstruction Begins, Part 1, an online U.S. history tutorial for students in 11th grade. In 1865, the bloody Civil War came to an end. The Southern armies of the Confederacy surrendered to the Northern armies of the Union, and America was once again a United States. But what happened after the Civil War? How did Americans reunite and form a new kind of union without slavery, in which former slaves were now citizens with equal rights? It wasn't a smooth or easy process. Welcome to the first of two tutorials about the Reconstruction era. In this tutorial, you'll learn about the North's goals and aims for Reconstruction. You'll learn about the divisions in the Republican Party that divided Republicans into moderates and radicals, and about Abraham Lincoln's ideas for Reconstruction before his death. Then you'll learn about Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson, whose war with Congress over Reconstruction policy was unprecedented in American history. It led to Johnson's impeachment and eventually to a policy of radical Reconstruction led by Congress that transformed the post-Civil War South. And you'll learn about some of the most important achievements of the Reconstruction era, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The era of Reconstruction immediately followed the Civil War, so let's review what you might already know about that conflict. The Civil War began in 1861 after 11 Southern states, seen here in red, seceded from or left the United States. They claimed to be their own independent nation, the Confederate States of America. This led the remaining states of the Union, seen here in blue, to go to war with the Confederacy to restore the U.S. as one nation. The reasons behind Southern secession are complicated, but it was largely motivated by a desire to protect slavery, which had come to dominate the economy and culture of the South. In the North, the abolitionist movement wanted to end slavery completely and immediately, and the newly formed Republican Party, whose political strength was in the North, wanted to restrict the spread of slavery. After Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, was elected president in 1860, South Carolina led the way by seceding from the Union. War would soon follow. So would the end of slavery, in a way. By 1863, Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a military order freeing all slaves in the rebel states. It was a crucial step toward freedom for African Americans. The Civil War lasted 4 years, far longer than anyone had anticipated. Southerners fought hard for their independence, but by 1865, the Confederacy was spent and defeated. After Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the Civil War essentially came to an end. Only 5 days later, President Lincoln was murdered, assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer. At the moment of its victory, the Union was overcome by deep mourning. What would become of the still divided United States, North and South? The task of reuniting Americans after the war was a monumental one. It needed the talents and wisdom of an Abraham Lincoln. Instead, the nation would need to grapple with the delicate, dangerous post-war period of Reconstruction without Lincoln's leadership. That was a lot of information. Let's review to see if you got it all. Some of these statements are correct, and some aren't. Pick all of the true statements and click Submit when you found them all. Correct. You remembered that it was the states of the Confederacy, not the Union, that seceded. The Emancipation Proclamation only ended slavery on a limited basis in the rebel states by military order. It would require an amendment to the Constitution to end slavery everywhere for all time. Now that we've reviewed the Civil War, let's set the stage for what came next, the era of Reconstruction. Reconstruction lasted from 1865 to 1877. When the war ended in 1865, there still remained two great unanswered questions about the future of the United States. First, on what terms were the 11 rebel states and their citizens to rejoin the Union? Many in the North still viewed them as traitors. Would these states simply be allowed to return as if it were business as usual, or would there be consequences for 4 years of rebellion? Second, what was to become of the millions of ex-slaves, the freedmen, as they were known at the time, in the South? They lacked land, money, and education, and most had known no other lives than that of slaves. Did they deserve all the same rights that white citizens enjoyed? Did the U.S. government have an obligation to help them transition to lives of freedom? These issues would continue to divide America as bitterly during Reconstruction as they had during the war years. In fact, it's somewhat helpful to think of Reconstruction as the Civil War Part 2, the Cold War that began after the fighting stopped at Appomattox in 1865. You can click on the map to reveal some extra information. Was the Confederate States of America an actual independent nation? It's debatable. For more than 4 years, the Confederacy ran its own government, issued its own currency, conducted diplomatic relations with other nations, and armed its own military. All of the things that nations are expected to do. On the other hand, President Lincoln always insisted that states could not legally secede from the Union. Therefore, there was no such thing as the Confederate States. He simply considered the 11 southern states to be in rebellion against their legitimate government. Because of this, Lincoln believed it should be relatively easy for the rebel states to return to the Union, as in his view, they had never truly left. Reconstruction overlapped with the Civil War itself. In the war's final years, as it became more and more clear that the Union would achieve victory, its leaders began to grapple with the issues of reunification. One question was central. Which part of the government had the authority to reconstruct the Union, Congress or the President? Not surprisingly, President Lincoln, before his death, believed that Reconstruction was the responsibility of his office, the executive branch. Because Lincoln did not live to see post-war Reconstruction, we can only guess at how he might have fully handled it as president. Still, his words and actions offer some interesting hints. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln was inaugurated for a second term. He delivered one of the most famous speeches of his presidency, his second inaugural address. Lincoln was already looking ahead toward peace as he delivered these words. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Lincoln spoke of healing and charity. He warned against malice, ill will, or vengeance, but he also spoke of firmness in doing the right thing, and talked about achieving a peace that was just and lasting. Whatever Lincoln may have believed, he seems not to have been bent on a radical path to Reconstruction. Even during the war years, Lincoln's Republican Party had begun to split between moderates and so-called radicals. The word radical means extreme, and that's what these Republicans' beliefs seemed like at the time, even to many in their own party. Most radical Republicans had long been active in the abolitionist movement to emancipate slaves. They saw in the Civil War an opportunity to thoroughly transform the American South, especially the dynamic between white and black people there. They wanted the seceded states to be cleansed of rebel influences before they could rejoin the Union, and they wanted the freedmen of the ex-Confederacy to enjoy the full civil rights that white citizens were guaranteed under the Constitution. In the early 1860s, these ideas were still radical. Some even saw them in terms of punishing the South for the Civil War. You can click on the photo to learn more about radical Republicans. Calling someone a radical can be a bit insulting, as that word implies that their ideas are so dangerous that they might bring about a revolution. Most so-called radicals don't view their own ideas as radicals. They just think they're right. In the case of Republicans in the 1860s, it seems the radical label was originally used to stigmatize members of the party with views on civil rights that were outside the mainstream. But many of them seem to have embraced the insult, proudly embracing the name of radical Republicans. Today, their views on race and equality don't seem radical at all. Pretty much all Americans believe that people of different races should have the same civil rights and protections, including the right to vote. But it's worth remembering that in 1865, even after the Civil War, these views were still considered extreme and dangerous, even by many in the North and in the Republican Party. These Republicans may have been radical for their time, but they were also ahead of it. Let's review some of the terms you've learned, and will continue to use throughout this tutorial. Drag and drop each definition on the right so that it fits with the correct term on the left. Right. Secession means withdrawal or separation from a nation, like the Confederate States attempted during the Civil War. Radical and moderate refer to two different schools of thought. Radicals want to see thorough political change, while moderates resist what they view as extremism. Emancipation refers to the freeing of people from slavery, and freedmen is a term referring to ex-slaves widely used during Reconstruction. While certainly old-fashioned, we will use it in this tutorial for that reason. Most Republicans, including Abraham Lincoln, didn't consider themselves radicals. Lincoln always considered himself the president of all Americans, North and South, black and white, rebel and loyal. Radical policies risked alienating one or more of those groups. More than a year before the war ended, the president put forth a decidedly moderate plan for readmitting Confederate states into the Union. Lincoln was willing to offer a full pardon to Southerners who rejected secession and accepted the abolition of slavery. They would keep their property, minus slaves, and their political rights. Under Lincoln's plan, if just 10% of the eligible voters in a state accepted these terms and took an oath of allegiance, they could reorganize their state governments and rejoin the Union. Congress found the plan unsatisfactory. Most Republicans, even many moderates, thought that the plan went too easy on the South. Radicals pointed out that the plan didn't include any measures to protect former slaves. Besides, these lawmakers believed that Reconstruction was a legislative responsibility, not the job of the president. So, lawmakers put forth their own plan, called the Wade-Davis Bill, after its two sponsors in Congress. It was both stricter and more radical than Lincoln's plan. The bill required half, not 10%, of voters to pledge allegiance before a state could rejoin. It banned those who had held leadership positions in the Confederacy from holding office in the new state governments. And it guaranteed equality before the law for freedmen. Lincoln found this plan too extreme, at least during wartime. He refused to sign it, which effectively vetoed the Wade-Davis bill. On other things, Congress and President Lincoln did agree. In January 1865, the Senate and the House of Representatives both passed what would become the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment made emancipation official by banning slavery in all of the United States for all time. Although he did not need to, Lincoln signed the amendment as well and wrote the word approved on the document, the only time a president has ever done so. And in his last public speech in April 1865, Abraham Lincoln spoke publicly for the first time in support of suffrage, voting rights, for at least some African Americans. This was a position still considered radical at the time. Even Congress's Wade-Davis bill had not guaranteed black voting rights. Lincoln's views on race, equality, and Reconstruction were clearly evolving right up until his murder 3 days later. He would never have a chance to put them into practice or to lead the nation through Reconstruction. The 2012 movie Lincoln, directed by Steven Spielberg, depicts the struggle in the House of Representatives to pass the 13th Amendment. The House had already voted against the amendment once, and Lincoln was desperate to have it become a part of his legacy. The president worried that, without it, his Emancipation Proclamation might be reversed or found invalid after the war. The movie shows Lincoln's associates securing votes for the amendment by any means necessary, even promising government jobs and handing out bribes to congressmen. The 13th Amendment passed the House by a vote of 119 to 56. Black onlookers, who had only recently been allowed to attend sessions of Congress, cheered and openly wept, as did many of the amendment's white supporters.